When you turn on the news, when you do a Google search looking for issues of war and conflict, it seems like, for the most part, you can tell where and when it happens. We know about the wars in the Middle East, we know about other conflicts happening around the world, and we can see these videos of them. But what about the acts of war that we can't see? I think it's fair to say that if you ask any InfoSec expert, that's information security, someone who works with hacking and cybersecurity infrastructure, they will tell you that we are consistently under attack from advanced, persistent threats, meaning there is acts of war happening all the time, frequently between countries that are at odds with each other. Today we're hearing that the US government has stated Russia has been attempting or has broken into US electrical infrastructure. And a lot of people are wondering what this means. But there's more to the story than just what actually happened with the claims from the Trump administration. There's also a lot of history behind this and reason to believe it might not be true. This is not the first time Russia has been accused of attempting or actually breaking into US infrastructure. Before I get into all that, let me give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, all of you guys. If you haven't already, go to patreon.com/Timcast and become a patron today. There are several different tiers to choose from. Most notably is tier 1 at $10 per month. You get access to behind the scenes photos and videos, bonus commentary videos. Typically, this is when I'm out in the field reporting, and hopefully as things warm up, there will be more stories that I will be traveling to, so stay tuned for that. But with your support, I can continue doing the work that I do. The story from Reuters: in a first, US blames Russia for cyber attacks on energy grid. The Trump administration on Thursday blamed the Russian government for a campaign of cyber attacks stretching back at least 2 years that targeted the US power grid, marking the first time the United States has publicly accused Moscow of hacking into American energy infrastructure. Beginning in March 2016 or possibly earlier, Russian government hackers sought to penetrate multiple US critical infrastructure sectors, including energy, nuclear, commercial facilities, water, aviation, and manufacturing, according to a US security alert published Thursday. The direct condemnation of Moscow represented an escalation in the Trump administration's attempts to deter Russia's aggression in cyberspace after senior US intelligence officials said in recent weeks the Kremlin believes it can launch hacking operations against the West with impunity. It coincided with a decision Thursday by the US Treasury Department to impose sanctions on 19 Russian people and 5 groups, including Moscow's intelligence services, for meddling in the 2016 US presidential election and other malicious cyber attacks. I've had many conversations with people who work in information security and cybersecurity, and what they tend to say to me is, yes, this stuff is happening all the time. There is an actual cyber war happening that we can't see. And you might hear these stories about Russia, but rest assured, other countries are involved in this as well. I wouldn't purport to be an expert enough on how any of this stuff works to claim whether it is or is not true. But what I can say is I have many sources within the hacker community that all tend to agree there is something happening beneath the surface. But it's much more complicated than just accusing Russia of doing this. And it's particularly interesting that the Trump administration is stating this goes back nearly 2 years. Because about a year and a half ago, the Washington Post had to change or retract a story that they got wrong when they said that Russia actually intruded in the US electrical grid. The story is from December 31st, 2016, and this is the Washington Post. Russian operation hacked a Vermont utility, showing risk to US electrical grid security, officials say. But sure enough, up top is an editor's note. An earlier version of the story incorrectly said that Russian hackers had penetrated the US electrical grid. Authorities say there is no indication of that so far. The computer at Burlington Electric that was hacked was not attached to the grid. This is the story we heard about a year and a half ago, that Russians had actually gained access to the US electrical grid. But as we can see, the Washington Post had to correct their incorrect statement that the Russians did not actually gain access to our electrical grid. Forbes followed up on New Year's Day. Fake news and how the Washington Post rewrote its story on Russian hacking of the power grid. The story goes on to talk about how the Washington Post changed their story over and over again, until only after numerous outlets called out the Post's changes did the newspaper finally append an editorial note at the very bottom of the article more than half a day later saying, An earlier version of the story incorrectly said Russian hackers had penetrated the US electrical grid. Yet even this correction is not a true reflection of public facts as known. The utility indicated only that a laptop was found to contain malware that has previously been associated with Russian hackers. In order to better understand what went wrong with this story and how the Washington Post took the initial reporting that a laptop was infected with some malware and turned it into Russians broke into the electrical grid, I reached out to an information security expert who wished to remain anonymous, but provided me with this quote. Basically, it's like this. You are an incompetent sysadmin. You got owned by a malware from a porn site. What do? Obviously, blame Russians and advanced persistent threats. Basically implying that in this particular story, it was a laptop. Maybe somebody was going on some dumb website, accidentally got infected with some malware, and then instead of taking responsibility for their own bad security practices, they claimed it must be a foreign operative, maybe Russia. In a story from February 25th, 2015, Quinn Norton wrote, "Attribution is hard." This story has to do with Sony being hacked, and many people blamed North Korea for the hack. Quinn Norton wrote, "It's so much easier to talk about the DPRK and Sony because most hackers either can't be located or accessed by law enforcement. Making it North Korea gives us something to do and think about. Blaming the DPRK is a preferable story to admitting we can't do anything about the Sony hack, or asking why Sony is always a target. Honestly, at some point, it became hard to not blame Sony for their security woes. And that point was 2011. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me more than 20 times in one 12-month period alone, shame on me." Back to the Reuters story. The decision by the United States to publicly attribute hacking attempts to American critical infrastructure was unprecedented and extraordinary, said Amit Yoren, a former US official who founded DHS's Computer Emergency Response Team. "I have never seen anything like this," said Yoren, now chief executive of the cyber firm Tenable. A White House National Security Council spokesman did not respond when asked what specifically prompted the public blaming of Russia. US officials have historically been reluctant to call out such activity in part because the United States also spies on infrastructure in other parts of the world. And that's where we're left. Most people who have an understanding of information security and cyber war will tell you, when you hear a story like this, keep in mind the US does the same thing. When we talk about Russian interference in the US election, the US does the exact same thing. Now, let's not get into whataboutism. If it is true that Russia has actually infiltrated or attempted to infiltrate US infrastructure, that is serious. And we need to make sure we take the right steps as a nation to prevent all-out war. I don't know if we would ever see full-scale ground war at this point in technological advancement. A lot of what we see when it comes to warfare is international cyber attacks, when a foreign government tries to break into our computer servers, steal information, and disrupt our economy. They don't need to necessarily win us over with force if they can win us over with manipulation and by destroying or stealing specific information that gives them leverage over us. At the same time, it is very difficult to know what is true, and this makes our security even weaker. When we were told nearly a year and a half ago that Russians had infiltrated the US electrical grid, people were shocked, but then it turned out to be not true. And in the instance of this information security expert, maybe it was just someone on a laptop who went to a porn site and got a virus. But now we're hearing the Trump administration flat out say, no, Russia has been doing this for the past 2 years. And this is going to make many people wonder. When we're constantly berated by factually incorrect stories, when some of the biggest breaking news turns out to be fake, how can anyone trust what is actually going on? This weakens our security and puts us, our country, and our allied nations at risk. We need to make sure we do what we can to take a sound approach to this, approach it reasonably. I think it's very likely this is true, but at the same time, with the news of the past, it's hard to know for sure. But nonetheless, it is unprecedented, and it's extremely interesting that we're hearing the US government call out the Russian government straight up. So let me know what you think in the comments below. How do you feel about all this? Do you trust these stories about Russia's interference and attacks on the United States? Or is it just another part of what we do as well, of international espionage and cyber warfare? Is it as big a deal as people make it out to be? And how do you feel about the Trump administration coming out and making these claims? Comment below. We'll keep the conversation going. You can follow me on Twitter at Timcast. Stay tuned. New videos every day at 4 p.m. Thank you all so much for hanging out, and I will see you all tomorrow.